Good morning, friends. Today we're going to be reading from chapter 11 of Home Again. It is actually quite a long chapter. I was a little surprised by that, so I think we'll get right to it. Chapter 11. Garrett was back. Robert had seen him pull up in front of Poppy's cottage. How could he not? He'd been checking in guests at the time and had gone onto the covered porch to help a long-time guest with her bags. He'd known the second Garrett swung his foot over the bike who it was. He looked different, older, yet somehow less self-assured. That was a good thing, Robert thought. Garrett's propensity toward self-righteousness was one of the least likable things about the man he'd become. Robert had watched, surprised when he saw Poppy light up talking with his son. He hadn't seen that much fight in Poppy for more than a year. It intrigued him, and he wanted to see more of Poppy's true nature come out and play. They say you can judge a person by how they treat children and animals. Robert always thought that was backwards. If you really wanted to know the merits of a person's soul, all you had to do was see how children and animals respond to the person. Not foolproof, but a pretty good indicator. He'd been trying to coax the scraggly bit of what he assumed was a dog toward a bath for weeks, to no avail. Every time the dog caught him at it, it ran behind the old oak tree, peering out at him from behind it like it knew what he wanted and was never going to cooperate. As for children, well, Robert finally figured that one out. He and Astrid were best mates, partners in crime, as it were. He loved that little girl with every ounce of his being, and the strange thing was, she loved him back, like he was everything right in the world. He'd figured out how to be a great grandparent before he figured out how to be a decent parent. Like many things in his life, he got that backwards. Robert didn't beat himself up too badly about it. How could he when he'd gotten Astrid out of the deal? The fact was, he couldn't go backwards, and even if he could, he probably wouldn't go back with the knowledge he had now. He'd go back to a time when he parented like most fathers did in the 80s and 90s. That was the greed is good era, when working wasn't just a way to support your family. It was a god to be revered in and of itself. Working 70-plus hours a week as a relatively young professional wasn't just expected, it was mandatory for success. And success was measured by how much you worked, the quality of your watch and your shoes, how big your house was, and what zip code you resided in. Success wasn't defined by how much time you spent with your children. Even for the professional women he knew, they took less maternity leave. A female partner at his firm had taken just 2 days. And if they needed child care, they were looked down upon for wanting to do it themselves. Then came the crashes. First, the savings and loan crash of the late 80s and early 90s. People knew that then what they worshipped as a brass ring to an inevitable life was a mirage. But that feeling didn't last long. By the mid-90s, greed was back and so were the punishing hours. More productivity and less worker wages. A very few did very well, and those who wanted to be counted among the few let it happen. Then came 2008. The era of the biggest and the best came to a screeching halt. It didn't matter how long you worked during the week or how many years in a row. You did it. Your work and your service were simply a commodity that was no longer required. It didn't matter that you missed your child's parent-teacher conference for the sake of your job. It didn't matter that you worked Father's Day on trial prep. It didn't matter that you spent whole weeks getting home after your children were already in bed. Well, that wasn't quite true, Robert thought. It did matter to the children you absented yourself from. It no longer mattered, if it ever really did, to those who signed your paychecks. Robert had been a parent of his times, and he was deeply sorry for that. Even if he could go back, Robert didn't want to go back to that world. It was a selfish and self-serving time. and he feared he'd be the same self-serving asshole he'd been then all over again. He could move forward with purpose. He could use every tool at his disposal to try to have a relationship with his son now. Even the tools that lived in that gray area relegated to parental ethics. Robert looked around casually, as if he wasn't breaking into his son's house. It technically wasn't breaking in. He did have a key. Leaf gave it to him when he needed to be out of town for a few weeks last fall, and the heat needed to be turned on. Leaf asked for the key back, and Robert had given it after he made a copy. Robert entered quickly and got to work. It wasn't his intent to do too much damage. He just needed a reason for Garrett to move into the cottage he kept empty right next to Poppy's cottage. Not long-term, just long-term enough for him to have an excuse to keep running into his son. Owning and running your own B&B had its advantages. One of them was a better-than-average knowledge of plumbing. A tweak here, a fiddle there, and the bathroom near Garrett's study downstairs would need some repair. Enough repair that he wouldn't be working in his study for a few days. Robert felt a pang of what he thought might be regret. It fled with the knowledge that if he didn't do something, Garrett would simply ignore him. Intrigued, but cautious of the time he was taking, Robert looked through Garrett's study. His desk, an old slab of wood he held up by two pillars of rough brick on each end, was clean. A closed laptop sat dormant on the left side of the desk. A pad of paper lay on the right side. Oddly enough, it was a legal pad, the kind Robert used to use. It was clean, empty, and brand new. An old mug held an assortment of pens, pencils, and scissors. Leela's favorite mug, Robert remembered. It had the Disney character Stitch on a surfboard with a girl, what was her name, who adopted him. The garbage can right next to the desk was empty. No crumpled sheets of paper, no pencil shavings, nothing. Not even a used paper plate. Garrett wasn't working. With any luck and some well-meaning parental shenanigans, that would soon change. It wasn't just Robert's relationship with Garrett that mattered. More importantly to Robert, it was Garrett's career that mattered. He knew something about the value of doing what you love for a living. He'd do everything he could to ensure Garrett didn't lose his livelihood. Robert took one last look around Garrett's house. It was homey in the way that Beverly and then Leela had made it for Robert and Garrett. Still, it felt unoccupied, even though Garrett was home again. Hopefully that would change too. Hopefully Garrett's house would become a true home. "Look, Mary, it's Captain America!" Garrett heard the exuberant voice and knew he was once again in the company of a handsome female, his favorite one so far. That enthusiasm alone made him smile, even as moniker made him outwardly cringe when used in adult company. The other females in the shop were definitely adults. He gave what he hoped was a self-deprecating expression to the room in general. Then his phone rang, saving him, for the moment, from having to explain Astrid's name for him, his general appearance in Fish Creek, and his reasons for being here. He lifted the phone, indicating he was going to answer it, and ducked out of Now and Zen more quickly than he'd entered. Princess Mayhem did not follow. He got a clear shot of Astrid hugging her and oohing and eyeing over how pretty she was in the seconds before his phone rang. If he were that dog, he'd stay put too. Garrett made his way to the beautiful courtyard garden and sat on a bright purple Adirondack chair. It was oversized, fit him well, and was more comfortable than it looked. A squirrel made its way to within a foot of him, looked at him expectantly, and then squeaked with what Garrett took to be displeasure at the lack of treats. The call cut off. He didn't pick it up in time. Garrett knew Sam Hunt well enough to know that if the information Sam wanted to relay was urgent enough, Sam would simply call back until he received an answer. Garrett looked up. The squirrel was still chattering at him. Sorry, buddy, no free lunch today. Garrett felt like an ass the second he said it. Not only had the events of the last week relegated him to talking back to squirrels, he felt an odd premonition that his days of relatively free lunches may be over as well. Now I'm empathizing with a squirrel. Great. Garrett sighed. Just great. The squirrel gave him one last hair-raising chatter and moved off as if to say, Hey dude, I've got to get busy collecting my nuts for winter. How about you? That's when Sam called back, right on cue. Garrett answered immediately. I just got chewed out by a squirrel. Please tell me I've got enough nuts collected to see me through the winter. There was a pause on the other end, followed by silence. Sam? I'm here. Just trying to figure out how to properly describe my talks about the addendum to your contract, which is no longer an addendum, by the way. Your publisher has exercised their option to revoke your prior contract. In total, kaput. As in, you'd be fired, but for the new contract I just negotiated. You'd be fired, but for... Garrett had never been so happy to hear the word but in his life. It was the for that worried him. Now that the real crisis had been unequivocally laid out, Garrett was surprisingly calm. He also answered his own question. No, he did not have enough nuts squirreled away for winter. Yes, he was going to have to engage in immediate, no-holds-barred nut gathering if he wanted to make it through. Sam waited for his reaction. That was the thing about Sam. He was patient and he listened to reactions before he let the guillotine loose. Thank you, Garrett said. What are you thanking me for exactly? Sam asked, sounding hesitant for the first time. Sam Hunt didn't do hesitancy. Sam did emphatic certainty that whatever he was suggesting was the best way forward. I'm thanking you for getting them to back off what I'm sure was their "you're fired" starting position. Sam said nothing, indicating that wasn't just his publisher's starting position, but more probably their middle and ending positions as well. Garrett knew then that Sam had pulled a miracle out of his hat to save Garrett's job. Garrett swore to himself whatever it took. He was not only going to fight his way back, he was going to do whatever it took to repay Sam. You're not going to like the new contract, Sam said with certainty. I'm going to like it a hell of a lot more than having no contract. Again, Sam was silent. Garrett rubbed his eyes, feeling suddenly tired. Just give it to me, Sam. The ominous silence isn't productive. By the lack of words, I'm guessing I need to be productive right now. Yesterday, he heard Sam say under his breath. Garrett got out of the Adirondack chair, a feat easier in concept than reality. He heard giggling behind him and turned around just in time to see Astrid and another blonde duck under the open window. Garrett walked farther into the garden, hopefully out of earshot of his eavesdroppers. Spit it out already, you suck at this, in case you were wondering. Okay, Sam said. You still got until August 30th, 1 minute after midnight on the 29th to be precise, to deliver the book in full. That wasn't so bad, Garrett thought. He'd been told he'd have an extra week, and he wouldn't have to deliver his first draft until after Labor Day, but 1 week wouldn't kill him. He had all his research. He loved researching, and that didn't require any form of muse. He also had a rough outline, and he'd laid out each of his chapters and their content. He could have used the extra week. Still, he could do it. It'd be a hell of a push, but he could do it. He had to. 11 weeks is pushing it, Sam. It's 10 weeks, and that's only if you get me copy by 6 each day so I can have it edited as we go. What are you talking about? Garrett snapped, immediately wishing he hadn't. Sam generally started with the good news. If he was losing it now, that didn't bode well for his mental state or his career. Since Garrett needed both in good shape, he tamped down his frustration. They're no longer willing to accept a rough draft and spend their resources on the first edits. You have to give them a polished manuscript at your expense, and you must do it by midnight on the 29th of August. Fuck. Yeah. Garrett could practically hear Sam nodding his agreement. The solidarity helped ease Garrett's escalating sense of panic. Okay. Assuming I can pull off that small miracle, what's next? Glory interviews you and your dad for an hour-long special. She gets complete access to you, your dad, and anyone connected to the Red Robin Inn for the Shall we start that one again? Glory interviews you and your dad for an hour-long special. She gets complete access to you, your dad, and anyone connected to the Red Robin Inn for the entirety of Labor Day weekend. The show airs a week after that. Garrett closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. He wasn't prone to tension headaches, but he wasn't immune to them either. He took a deep breath, trying to stave off this one. Have you spoken to Robert about that? Labor Day weekend is one of the busiest of the tourist season up here. Yes. Garrett dropped his hand and stood up straighter, his eye wandering to a young father trying to rein in a toddler running toward a bee-filled rosebush. And he agreed? Garrett asked, hopeful and incredulous at the same time. Had their situations been reversed, Garrett would have seriously considered telling his son to go to hell. The father scooped up the toddler, a chubby, rosy-cheeked, red-headed girl who shrieked her displeasure at being impeded from her goal. Garrett knew just how she felt. He did. Since Garrett didn't know what to say to that, he asked, what's next? How do you know there's more? Because with you, Sam, there's always more, and it's rarely good. You have to hand in edited pages every week, Friday by 7. You cannot go more than 50 miles outside Fish Creek without written permission from your father. Garrett started coughing. Sam ignored him. Continuing, he rattled off in rapid succession the rest of the restrictions placed upon him by a contract no other writer in their right mind would sign. Hazard House, one of the top 5 publishers in the world, obviously didn't want Garrett Oakley anymore. They crafted the deal they did on the off chance Garrett's next book would make them as much money as his first book had. Once Sam delivered this book, and he would, he didn't ever want to do business with Hazard House again. Garrett was silent until the last bit. What? He asked, incredulous. Sam sighed. I said you have to live and work within 2 blocks of the Red Robin Inn. I got that, Garrett said, waving that away. His house was within 2 blocks, so that was easy enough. Say the last part again. I'm standing in your living room. It's flooded, and it smells like a septic system exploded. I need new shoes. The plumber is here telling me it'll take a week to fix. I've called the only other B&B within 2 blocks of the Red Robin, and they don't have a vacancy. I called Robert. He does have a cottage you can rent for the next week. A cottage I already booked for you. Let me get this straight, and please stop me if I've got anything wrong. Okay, shoot. My house is flooded, and it's going to take a week to fix. Silence. I have to live right next to my father for the next 7 days. Silence. I have 10 weeks to finish and edit a manuscript I haven't started. Garrett hadn't said those words out loud to anyone, much less his agent. And I have to get a note from my father to go on any field trips. Yep, that about sums it up. Anything else? Garrett asked, regretting it as quickly as the words were out of his mouth. Yeah, actually. Garrett rubbed his temple and the now throbbing area above his left eye. Poppy Hansen stopped by as I was talking with the plumber. Of course she did. I'm your +1 for dinner. See you at 6. Garrett disconnected without answering. After he collected Princess Mayhem, he was going to have to go back and grab a bag of clothes, his notes, and his computer. It seemed for the next week at least, fate had conspired to put him in the last place he wanted to be, right next to Robert Oakley, a place he'd run from since he was 17. 10 weeks. It's only 10 weeks. 10 weeks, and this nightmare is over. Only 10 weeks. How in the name of heaven was he supposed to finish what he hadn't yet started in 10 bloomin' weeks? Garrett hadn't realized he'd asked any of that out loud until he spun around and came face to face with a Cheshire cat smiling Poppy Hansen. Shall we go inside and find out? She asked, grinning widely at him. What have you got to lose? And that was how he got suckered into his first tarot reading. Alright, so tomorrow when we start chapter 12, got these little tarot cards there under chapter 12, we'll get into just that. So I'm looking forward to it. And if we have time, if it's a short enough chapter, I'll show you some of my books on tarot and my cards. I have a number of decks of cards and they're really fun. The spreads that I use in here are actual spreads that I did right before I wrote the chapters. So I didn't make the cards suit the chapter, I made the chapter suit the cards. So I had fun doing that, and if you are ever stuck in whatever you're doing, if you're journaling, if you're doing any kind of writing, if you're wondering just where to put your focus during the day, if you meditate, that's fabulous. But if you ever just want to grab a card and take a look at that, sometimes that can get the creative juices flowing too. So anyway, thank you for spending time with me today. Have a good day, the rest of your day, and be well. See you tomorrow.